Great plan. Well, Clemmers, if you guys would please come up together. Yeah, it's wonderful to have you here today. Thank you so much.
It's always great to come home. Always great to be back at Columbia Street. Bill will talk more about why we're here, but before he does, I just want to say that we talked about the night program for the street children, and it opened a week and a half ago. We had a wonderful, actually the 30 Sunday school teachers went in to the room the night before, they cleaned it up, and they prayed all night long over each bed, and then we opened it for the children. The children, some of the ones who had already gone home came back, and they stood up in the room and gave testimonies of how much their life has changed since going through our program and being able to go and be with their families again. And it's just the coolest thing in the world. We're going to make a video, and we'll share it. You can watch it at some point to see the joy on these kids' faces is really something else. So anyway, go ahead.
It is always nice to have Ann have the first word, because then I can make sure that I don't repeat. We're really happy to be home. As for those of you who don't know us, my name is Bill. This is my wife, Ann, and we have been missionaries with the American Baptist Churches since 1992. We actually were commissioned right down there when we had 3 kids and 1 on the way, and it's always great to come home. We live in Orono, Maine, and we were happy to come home and see that our house is still standing. We had 7 months of mail and a few mice that spent the winter in our home, but it is great to be here. We're home for 3.5 months of deputation. Every 4 years, we're asked to visit our churches, and starting next Sunday, Michael, I'm so sorry that we won't be here on the 9th. We'll be in Arbor, Maine, and then we travel south as far as Richmond, Virginia, over to New Mexico, California, and back. But the good thing is I will get to be with my wife, Ann, and she's driving, so we'll be safe. But it's always great to be home. When we actually arrived the day before yesterday. We had a long flight from Africa. We decided, though, because the American Baptists were having their biennial convention in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and we have a daughter-in-law who was from Puerto Rico with our son, her husband, and we have a new grandson who was just named after their granddad, so we decided American Baptist Biennial Conference in Puerto Rico. So we decided that we could probably spend a third of our time in the conference and 2/3 of the time with our family. So on our flight from Congo to Boston, we actually diverted to Atlanta and then took a flight to Puerto Rico. I was sitting next to a very sweet African-American lady on the flight. We were in Delta Comfort. We were upgraded, I guess, because we flew for so long, and her boyfriend was back in coach. And so we had all kinds of time to basically talk about what we do in Africa. And when we landed, she said, "Oh, Dr. Bill, you should really write a book." So I arrived home yesterday, and I knew that I'd be here this morning, and I was thinking, actually, that book has already been written. I was thinking of Psalm 23. "For the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Our testimony is 31 years in Haiti, Congo, Somalia, Yemen. I've been asked to go to Ukraine when we get back. The Lord has provided our needs each and every day. He makes us to lie in green pastures beside still waters. I don't know about you, but when I'm in Africa, knowing where the Lord wants me, I sleep so well. It's only when I come back to Maine and I go through 7 months of mail and I see a tax bill. I get a jury notice from February. I have to go to Penobscot County Court Monday so I don't get arrested. All the issues of living in this country, I don't sleep as well. as where I am where the Lord wants us. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Not the rebels that surrounded our town this past few months, or Ebola, or cholera, or volcanoes, or we evacuated because of none of those things. He prepareth a table for me where there are my enemies. He anointeth my head with oil, my cup overfloweth. Well, in Africa, our enemies are not the African people. Those are the ones who we love and serve and feel so close with. My enemies, as a doctor, are the germs, cholera, Ebola, malaria. But the Lord provided for 31 years all the tools that I could ever need, the nurses and doctors and medication and knowledge, and the Lord was always there. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow us all the days of our life. And we look forward to the time when we will be in his house. So the book that I was asked to write is already been written. I can just sing God's praises. And we thank you for your blessings and your support. And it's so good to spend our first Sunday here. Michael, I wish I could be here next Sunday, but on the road. But we will think of you and the blessing you are to this church, who we love so, so much. Thank you so much.
I missed you guys last week. Had a little bit of a cold and lost my voice, and I was hoping I could make it, but you would have had to have me whisper the whole time. So it's nice to be back with you today. We started a new sermon series a couple weeks ago, and my title is everything okay with your heart? And what we're talking about for a few weeks is just our hearts, and kind of taking a temperature rating of your heart and to kind of see what's going on, because out of our hearts, our mouth speaks. We read, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 15, verse 16, we read this 2 weeks ago, it says this, "Don't you see that whatever enters your mouth goes into the stomach and then out the body? But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and they defile him. For out of the heart come evil thoughts." And we talked about this in the first week about the things that we say, that they come out of the heart. And sometimes we like to think, no, I didn't really mean to say that. Or you say something and you're thinking, where did that come from? Well, Jesus would say it came out of your heart. And so for the few weeks, we're going to look at what are the things that are in your hearts. Because your heart, whatever's in there, it will be the boss of you. It's going to dictate, direct the things you say, the things you do, the things you think. So if you want to change our lives, we must change what is in our hearts. How many in here have Facebook or Instagram? Raise your hand if you have that. So a good amount of you. Facebook, Instagram, they're cool. They're social media sites if you don't have one, where you can connect with friends. There's some powerful, good things about them. Like I can connect with some of the guys I went to college with, and where they're pastoring. They're all over the country, and kind of keep up to date with what's happening with that. But I think, for me personally, I think Facebook and Instagram, especially for younger people, that it's almost like a highlight reel. You can look at Facebook and Instagram or any of those type of things, and the problem with it is that you only see someone's highlight reel. You don't see when they're sad or when they're depressed or when they had a bad day or the hard days at work. You just kind of see vacations. The kids are always smiling and happy. You don't see the normal, the house is a mess and the plates are still on the counters and, the dog peed on the floor. You just see the best parts of them. And that's okay. But what it kind of does is eventually, if you look at that stuff enough, it can create envy in our hearts. Because we look at our lives, and then we look at the lives of our friends and family on Facebook, and we're like, wow, we don't compare. And so we try to highlight, make our highlight reel look a little better, use some filters on those pictures, only take the best pictures, upload them to Facebook so that we can look better, because all of our friends and family, they look great. And it's kind of, it's fun, but it's not a real picture of life, in my opinion. Because it's not everything. It's just usually the best things. And so when you play this kind of comparison game, which we've probably all played before, it either does one of two things. It either makes us think, I need to up my game, like I need to take some better pictures, go on better vacations, do everything a little bit better, or we kind of just say, I'm just going to quit. I can't even compete. And when envy gets into our hearts, it can be an ugly boss of us. It can be really ugly. And I can tell you from experience that all of us have probably struggled with envy before. But it's a scary thing. I had my son and I, when he was 7 or 8 years old, we bought this old 1981 pickup truck. And I had an 85 when I was in high school, and I sold it when I went to college to pay for Bible college, so like everybody would be like, wow, you're such a nice person, but I did. And I've always wanted another one and to rebuild it, and so I bought one, and it was not a very nice truck, like rusted out, everything was wrong with it, and so I'm not super mechanical, but I'm a little bit, so I stripped everything down, took the bed off, and we sandblasted the frame, took all the rust out of it, and tried to replace stuff that needed to be replaced, and kind of started to restore this old truck. I got the bed beautiful, sandblasted, primed, new tires on it, and the truck started to come together and look really nice. But I hadn't touched the engine yet. And so eventually it worked, the engine worked, but I really didn't know what was going on with it. So I popped the hood, and actually I didn't even have a hood on it, so I just, dug into it, and the oil was this nice, thick, not oil. I'm not sure what it was, but it wasn't what I'd consider oil. And it smoked, and the headers leaked, like there was pretty much no exhaust on it. It just leaked out the side. Carburetor was really messed up, and it ran really, really bad. Smoked, and, I couldn't even get it in my garage because it kept, stalling and smoking. And so a friend of mine helped me, and we cleaned the carburetor out, and we changed the oil, and we put some gaskets in the exhaust, and we helped it to get, the air filter was, had a mouse nest in it, and everything was wrong with it. So it wasn't getting air, and the air wasn't going out, creating the pressure it's supposed to be, and the oil was thick and dirty, and had a lot wrong with it. So we cleaned it all out, and my friend of mine rebuilt the carburetor, put a nice new carburetor so you get the fuel it needed. The fuel lines were messed up, so we put some new fuel lines on. The gas tank had all kinds of gravel in it, so we got rid of the gas tank and put a new gas tank in it. And then I remember when we started it up, it ran like a brand new truck. And I tell you that story because we kind of cleaned out the heart of the truck, what drives it. And so sometimes we have to take a moment, pause, and ask ourselves, is everything okay with my heart? Is it getting the fuel, the oxygen it needs? Is it breathing correctly? Is my life going in the direction that I want it to go, or I keep stalling? And we'll stall over and over again in life when we let things like we're going to talk about today, like envy, like fear, like discontentment. When we let things like that rule our hearts, we never get to where we want to be. We're never content and happy with our lives. We're never fully used by the Lord. When I see envy or jealousy in my own life, I really hate it because it's ugly. I remember when I was pastoring in Hollowell, there was this, our church was growing. A lot of people from our community were a part of our church, and there was this guy that was related to a couple of the members of our church, and he was like a rock star in the Hollowell world. Like he owned a couple of the businesses there, owned a lot of businesses there, had this huge, huge house on the top of a hill. Speaking of Facebook, he was always on Facebook quoting himself, like you see people quote Elon Musk. Well, he quoted himself on this Facebook, and everybody was, in my opinion, they were envious. He had the most extravagant vacations. His kids were perfect. He was, everything about him was great. And so I had met him a few times. He seemed like a really nice guy, and I was hoping he'd come to church. And I remember telling some guys, hey, you know him, invite him to church. And they were like, oh, he's never going to come. There was a lot of envy and jealousy, and I thought, let's preach a sermon about it, concerning this guy. And so it came out in the news that he was going to court for tax evasion. And you'd hear that about somebody in your community, you'd be like, oh, that's too bad, hopefully they're okay. That's not the general census. It was like, almost like, thank goodness, God's real. People were almost happy that something bad happened to somebody. And it all boiled down to because we were jealous of that person. If you've ever had somebody in your life and they got knocked down a little bit by the world and you were like, well, good, now they're like the rest of us. You're like a little bit happy that that happened, then probably you are harboring some jealousy or some envy in your heart. Solomon in Proverbs 14:30 says, envy rots the bones. Envy rots the bones. Envy can rot your life, can rot your happiness, rot your future, rot your time, your enjoyment with your families. And it's something that's so simple and so normal. We see, 6-month, year-old children, having a toy, and then the other one wants it, and they're jealous and envious. Like it's pretty natural for us to have envy. So if you don't stand up against it, it'll probably naturally occur in our lives. But if we can identify it and say to envy, nope, you're not going to take root in my heart. That is not who I want to be and who I'm going to be. Then we can stop it, and we can focus on the race that God has designed for us. Envy leaves us competing with people in our lives who don't even know there's a competition. I think Andy Stanley said that once. That the real envy is competing with people who don't even know there is a competition. That you buy better because your neighbor has better and he or she doesn't even know that they're competing with you. How many things in your life have you ever done for other people and not for yourself? You did it, you bought that car, you bought that house, you dressed that way. We did a certain thing because of what people would think about us, not necessarily what we wanted in life. I think if you looked back, I know I can look back at my life and think, did a lot of things for what people would think and not necessarily for what I really needed or wanted, or what God needed or wanted for me in life. Solomon gives us this mental picture of what it feels like to drift towards envy or jealousy in our lives. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 4 says this. Solomon says, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless. I see that all toil and all achievement springs from one person's envy of another. King Solomon had great wealth. He had great perspective on life. And he kind of gives us his observations. He says, everyone is competing with everyone else. And everyone is determining how successful they are based on where everyone else is. And I don't think that has changed since Solomon wrote that. I think everyone is still competing with everyone else, and everyone is deciding, if they're good based on, if they're successful, or if they're wealthy, if they're, doing well in life based on where other people are at your age or in your neighborhood doing. And I think that's okay. We can look around and see people for what they're doing and how God's blessed them or the strengths they have and learn from them. But if that's driving us, if that's getting into our hearts and that's the reason that we're driven, then that could be allowing envy into your life. And envy makes a horrible boss. He goes on. In the end part of verse 4, he says, and I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Such a powerful verse. Let me read it to you one more time. And I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. He says, all the people that I look at, Solomon, looking at his kingdom, the people, he says, I see that the people who are toiling and achieving, working hard, he said most of the time, all the time, it's because that they are competing with someone else, that they're envious of what someone else has. And so I did this project. I took my notepad and I wrote, I said, what is it that I am toiling after? Because they use the word toil, so I'm like, I'll use it too. Like, what is it I'm chasing? Why do I work hard for what I do? Think about that question for a second. Because Solomon says that he looks at the toil people have, And he says it's like chasing after the wind. That's a pretty clear picture. You can't ever catch the wind. And we all know people in our lives, maybe you have children, grandchildren, spouses, brothers, sisters, who have spent their life chasing the wind. Like they are trying to catch something that you know they are never going to catch. It's sad. Because when we are chasing the wind, we're not able to do or to fulfill the calling God has for us. And when you spend your time chasing the wind, you're not able to be the person that God's called you to be, to run the race that God has set before you, because we are chasing something else. A chase after the wind is to me means you're never committed. There's this thirst that's unquenched. There's always, and I preached this to my last church, I said, there's always a bigger. There's always a faster. There's always a prettier. There's always a smarter. That if we are spending our lives trying to compete, there's always someone who's better. There's always a bigger. And so if we don't find contentment in who God has called us to be, then we are going to be dissatisfied, and we're not going to have peace forever, because you can always find a bigger. Always find it. If you look for it, you'll always find someone who's a little bit better at what you're trying to accomplish than you. And that just robs us of peace, robs us of happiness in our lives. Solomon goes on, he says, this is powerful, verse 6, he says, better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. He's talking about commitment, contentment. He said, better one handful with tranquility, with peace, than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. As I wrote down, what it is that I toil after? What is it that I'm chasing after? And so I wrote a few things that I could see myself trying to chase. Then I asked the question, I'm like, whom am I doing that for? Like, who do I chase the wind for? And most of the time it came up with my neighbors, my family, my children. Men especially, we come up with all kinds of reasons that we chase the wind. Well, I want to provide better, future for my children, for my spouse, for their children. And as I was trying to write and think about what it is that I'm chasing the wind for, and my kids kept coming up, I thought my kids would much rather have a dad who was home and content and enjoyed life than someone who was always chasing after the wind. So whom is it? Solomon asked it. What is it you toil after? Why do we do it? Who are we doing it for? Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Tranquility is satisfaction and peace. That it's something that feels so good. That it's something that my one handful is so much more enjoyable than my two handfuls, because I have peace. And all people, that's what they want. That's what they search for in peace. I don't mind working really hard. I don't mind long days. I don't mind situations and troubles and obstacles in my life, but I want to find some peace somewhere along the line. I want to have tranquility. I know that life's not just always a beach, right? But some beaches here and there would be nice. And Solomon points out that when we are chasing after the wind, when we're chasing after trying to compete with someone who doesn't even know they're in a competition, when we're trying to just be better because we want to look better to other people, then we won't find that peace and that tranquility. Verse 7, he says this, again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. In this culture, women could not inherit, so he has no sons and no brothers, so he had no one to leave his stuff to, yet his toil was to no end. Solomon would have asked that guy, why do you work so hard? Why do you toil so hard? Why do you keep pushing and pushing and pushing for more and more and more wealth when you're going to die and you don't even have anybody to leave it to? Because this person, like many, lived a life of envy, of jealousy, lived a life of saying, if I could just get a little bit more, If I could just have a little bit more, then I'd be happy. The Gallup polls did this poll in England, and they asked people who were made, $20,000 to $30,000 and $50,000 to $100,000 and $100,000 to $200,000, all the way up to $1 million. And they asked him this question. He said, how much more money would you need to feel comfortable? And he said that the average person said they need to make $10,000 a year to be comfortable, even right up to $1 million. That not one person said, yeah, right here, I'm good. Everybody needed to make just a little bit more. And if you look at the life of someone, a college student that's making $25,000 a year said he needed $10,000 more. And a person who's making $200,000 a year said they needed just $10,000 more. If you think of the raises you get from your first job to your retirement job, there's many times you get a $10,000 raise. And so the Gallup poll pretty much decided that no matter how much money people made, they would always want about $10,000 more a year. Because you can't ever catch it. You can't ever catch the wind. That it's a moving mark. And if you finally, make it to the six-figure club, there's always somebody who makes more, or who has more, or who has, my wife does not care about money at all, but she loves vacation. She lives, she would never spend, she doesn't buy, I buy her clothes because she needs them. She doesn't buy anything, but she wants to go on vacation. And so I think all of us are different. We all think of different things, but if all you cared about was, vacations, and you were content in your vacation, great, but there's always someone who has a bigger vacation. We had a couple of friends, we're planning a vacation. Next year is our 20th year anniversary for having been married for 20 years. And so we've been thinking the last couple of years, we want to go somewhere. We've been to, Florida. We went, before we had kids, went to Hawaii a few times. But we really want to go somewhere that's special. So we want to go to Australia. It's not set in stone, but I've always wanted to go there, and I think it would be cool. And so we're planning this, and we talked to a couple of our friends, who've never been planning it for 5 years, and I'm hoping next year to go to Australia. And a couple of our friends is we just got back from Australia last summer. We spent a month there, and we rented a yacht and traveled around the whole island. And I'm we're not going to do that, right? Ours is going to be less, but we're going to try to get there. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling? He asked. Whom am I toiling? What an amazing question. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be driven. I'm not saying you shouldn't work hard. Contrary, I feel like Christians should be the people we want to hire because they work so hard, because they're loyal, because they're moral, because of what they say they do. I think we should be outstanding workers, be driven, hard workers. But I think we have to put it into perspective of if envy or jealousy gets rooted into our heart, it makes us bad parents, makes us bad spouses, makes us bad witnesses. Because now we're competing with people instead of praying for them and blessing them and being a part of their lives. Ecclesiastes verse 9 says, "For whom am I toiling?" he asked, "and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business." If we're distracted by the envy or the toiling or the chasing of the wind in our lives, we are going to be distracted from God's purpose for our lives. I believe God sets a race for every one of us to run. If we're distracted by someone else's race and trying to run someone else's race, we're never going to fully fulfill the race God's called us to win. So we should stay in our lanes. We should count our many blessings. We should be thankful for what God has done in our lives and not always looking at what he has done in other people's lives and being jealous, because that's chasing the wind. I had the opportunity, I'll close with a story. I had the opportunity to, I met a man. For a few years, I was a chaplain for a military and police force motorcycle group. A friend of mine called, and he was state police, and I had a motorcycle at the time. And he said, "Would you be our chaplain And I had just Noah, my first son, and so I'm like, sure, I'd love to do that. And so for a few years, I rode with these guys, and we did some parades, and I did a couple of funerals for them, and we had a couple of big rallies, and I got to speak at. It was really cool. We had a lot of people come to our church through that outreach. But I met a man who was just it was kind of a weird meeting. I won't bore you with all the details, but I met a man who was a billionaire, and he lived in Naples, Florida. And he ended up flying me down, and I had met him online, and we talked about it. He was kind of associated with the motorcycle club that we were a part of. And he's needed me to come down, and he and his wife wanted me to renew their vows. So I'm like, sure, I'll come down. So he flew me down to Naples, picked me up in his Rolls Royce Phantom, and I didn't really know much about them, but it was $1.3 million, the car he picked me up in. And took me to his house, and it was 40,000 square feet, right on the ocean. So you look, and it's 4 stories. So we went to it was an eye-opening, incredible experience for sure, and it was just incredible, right on the beach in Naples, Florida. This guy's wife, this guy had a .com business that he sold for millions of dollars, and then he married this girl who was a yoga instructor. He's probably in his late 50s. And her grandfather invented the syringe. So they're very, very, very wealthy people, worth multiple billions of dollars. And had a helicopter pad on the top of his house. And I spent a few days with him, and it was just an incredible, I've never experienced life like that. He went to a restaurant, took me to a fancy restaurant, and he said, "What do you want?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know." So he told the waitress, he's like, "I want one of everything in here." And the bill was like $2,500 or something. It was crazy. But one thing I noticed about him is we went to his garage, and he had just tons of sports cars. I got to drive his Ferrari. I drove his Ferrari. He had probably 7 or 8 sports cars, everything you could think of. And so and he took me around his neighborhood, and this guy was probably the least happy man I'd ever met. Suicidal in his life, addicted to drugs and alcohol. The loneliest person I ever met. And he said, when you get this high, you don't have any friends anymore. No normal people want to be friends with you when you're like, "What are you going to do this weekend?" We're like, "Oh, we're going to take our private jet to Bermuda." So you lose, and we went through his neighborhood, and he'd be like, "Yeah, that house, that guy owns, Apple, and, he just built a new addition," and everything was comparison. Everything about that weekend down there showed me that having wealth like that, it would be more of a curse than a blessing, because he never had enough. That it was always so-and-so has a bigger house, and so-and-so has a yacht, and he doesn't have a yacht, and he was the least content person I ever met, and he was the richest person I'd ever known. And opened my eyes. I was 27 probably. Opened my eyes years ago to wealth doesn't buy happiness. They should have been really happy. He didn't have any kids, and his wife had kids from another marriage, and they hated her, estranged from her because they stopped the funds or didn't buy him a house, or I don't even know. But they were the least happy people in the world that I'd met, and the richest. And so I think that it was such a powerful example of for whom am I toiling? Why am I depriving myself of the enjoyment of life? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. Proverbs 14:30 says, "A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones." Envy can take the good blessings in our life, the happiness in our life, and rot the bones, rot the life. Because God created us to run a race, to make a difference, to bring, the gospel, bring peace, bring love to people. And when we get distracted from doing that, and we get focused on, I want to build an empire for myself so that people will think I'm awesome, it's going to take the peace and the contentment and the happiness right out of your life and replace it. So in our hearts, when you see envy, don't let that be the boss of you. Take an account, step back and say, why do I do this? and make sure what we do is for the right purposes and the right reasons. And always give that blessing back to God. Please stand with me. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the many blessings you've given us. And Lord, I thank you for the race that you've set for me to run. And I know that race is different than every other person in this room and their race. Lord, I pray you'll help us to have perseverance to run the race you set before us. And Lord, when we get distracted, when we start to compare, it's so easy to do. I know I'm guilty of it. When we start to see that, the areas of our life that we're lacking, and we're like, I got to work harder here, and I've got to buy bigger there and have better there, that we'll pause and we'll say, nope, I'm not letting that in my heart. I'm not doing it for those reasons. I'm going to focus on what God has called me to do, to run that race and thank him for every blessing he gives me along the way. Lord, I thank you so much for your Son, for the grace and the forgiveness you've bestowed upon us. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to focus our hearts on you. And when things get in there that are ugly, when we take account and we look at our hearts and we say, how are things doing with my heart, Lord? And we see things that shouldn't be there, Lord, that you'll give us the strength to clean it out, to get rid of those things and replace them with the thanksgiving we owe you. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. Thank you.
We'll close.